of Moneycontrol. Gaurav, the question that's being asked is, and people are drawing comparisons, whether rightly or wrongly, to Sri Lanka and to Pakistan, etc., saying that, look, how debt-ridden those countries have become. A large part of it, of course, was public debt. In the case of Sri Lanka, for a number of years, at least for the last 25, 30 years, they've been running public debt in excess of 100% of that country's GDP. India, of course, is no Sri Lanka. We have pretty robust foreign exchange reserves. Our economy is the fastest growing large economy in the world. But having said that, Moody's just last year had pointed out to the government debt burden, which it expected would be somewhere close to 90% of GDP, both state and central government debt put together. Is this sustainable?
Just to put things in context, if you cut back to 3 years ago, on May 8, 2019, and that was about, I think, a fortnight before the Lok Sabha election results were announced, the Reserve Bank of India had, the governor included, met the top brass of the Finance Commission, and then Shaktikanta Das, the RBI governor, had then warned of rising risks to fiscal consolidation of states as their finances were saddled with farm loan waivers, income support schemes, and of course, the Uday bonds, which are the power bonds for the power distribution companies. Now, we need to keep in mind that one of the primary objectives of subsidy or subsidized entitlements, just like the Food Security Act, is to ensure to address concerns of equity, and that was also seen during the free food grain entitlement during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are examples of achieving these in history, all across history. However, the problem starts when the governments, both the center and the state, starts to borrow fund for what is called funding non-revenue yielding expenditure. Now, if you look at RBI figures, for instance, these are very important figures that I'm going to quote. And this kind of tells you why states are actually borrowing beyond the means. In 2014, combined state debt to combined state borrowing was about 2.4 lakh crore. In 1920, that stood at about 6.34 lakh crore. The state borrowing to GDP, GSDP, gross state domestic product ratio, range from about 16% to 47%.
Okay.
In public finances, just as much as it is in households, borrowing in itself is not a bad idea. So far as this borrowing is actually used for asset creation, like building a house in the case of a household or a family, or infrastructure and other capital asset creation in the case of states. However, if you see the state finances, more than 80% of their expenditure is what is called revenue expenditure.
Gaurav, give me 1 second. I think there's some problem with your video as well. We'll try and see if we can fix that in a moment. Sorry to butt in there, but let's fix his video. I want to go to Professor Gautam Sen and ask him this. I think the point that Gaurav made is absolutely valid and absolutely bang on, where there's nothing wrong with borrowing. There's nothing wrong with the state borrowing as long as a bulk of that money, or at least a substantial part of that money, is used for capital expenditure to create infrastructure, to create better productivity and more productive individuals. In the case of states, for example, in Telangana, 63% of the revenues are simply used for subsidies. In the case of Punjab, 45% of the revenues that the state gets are used for one freebie or another. This is an unsustainable model. Between these three states, that's Telangana, Punjab, and Andhra Pradesh, there is a combined freebie bill of 2.5 lakh crores. I mean, this is a recipe for disaster. This is something that the Supreme Court mentioned as well in its hearing last week. Isn't this a recipe for disaster, Dr. Sen?
Well, this is obviously a very big problem as to how do you fund these freebies. I think there is no disagreement on the issue of providing basic needs for people, and India has always sought to do that, even at times when it was not well off. And now India is, 3 times richer than it was in 1990. So there are many more programs. The problem remains what everybody else has said, the trade-off between revenue expenditure, which is basically consumption, and asset creation and investment. So basically, are you going to take away from your children and grandchildren by splurging for political reasons? A lot of these freebies are not for basic needs. These are for electoral purposes. Now, the question is, how do you resolve that? It is very difficult to tell an elected government it cannot spend its budget as it so pleases. Now, the problem will arise when they come, as Mamata has come and Kejriwal has demanded money from the center. Now, that money comes from other states of India, which have been more frugal. Now, that is also not sustainable. The question is, how do you address this? You cannot get away from it. You cannot legislate against freebies. I am tempted to suggest that if your state's borrowing exceeds a certain percentage, maybe 25, 30%, you can give away as much money as you like. You can subsidize as much money as you like, but you must provision for that freebie upfront 1 month before the disbursement. So if you want to give away free electricity, 1 month's expenditure must be put aside into an escrow account. That, I think, will focus people's minds about what they're doing.
Gaurav, you want to respond to that? I mean, we did have the FRBM Act. It's still there. But because of the pandemic, you know, it has been given some kind of leeway and flexibility. But do you believe in a poor country, a developing country like India, it is even practical or feasible to tell elected governments that, look, you can't be spending your way through elections, or you can't be spending your way into power?
No, so that is the gray area. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's something called non-merit subsidies, and we need to make a distinction between non-merit subsidies and electoral freebies on one side, and merit subsidies were essentially welfare entitlements used for addressing concerns of equity. It is the non-merit subsidies which is the problem here. Now, if you look at the public finance figures, about 5.6% of GDP is accounted for by non-merit subsidies. But the problem doesn't start there. The problem doesn't end there. The problem is that a substantial part of those non-merit subsidies, about 4.7% of our entire GDP, is actually given by the states. So this, if we rationalize non-merit subsidies, a lot of fiscal elbow room will open up, a lot of fiscal space will open up for states to undertake development expenditure and also to actually carry out targeted welfare entitlements. The problem with electoral freebies is that non-merit subsidies or electoral freebies is actually equivalent to a promissory note coming in at the expense of taxpayers. It also, it also brings in an element of transactional activity into turning a voter to vote for a particular party. That is something where the problem needs to be addressed, because there is a welfare entitlement problem, there is a fiscal problem, and there is an attempt at making voting a transactional activity by process.
Okay, let me ask Ashish Sood about that. When a party offers